In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
But I do ask every publisher, every editor, and every newsman in the nation to re-examine his own standards and to recognize the nature of our country's peril. In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosures to the enemy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Today, no war has been declared, and however fierce the struggle may be, it may never be declared in the traditional fashion. Our way of life is under attack. Those who make themselves our enemy are advancing around the globe. The survival of our friends is in danger, and yet no war has been declared. No borders have been crossed by marching troops. No missiles have been fired. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security. If you are awaiting a finding of clear and present danger, then I can only say that the danger has never been more clear, and its presence has never been more imminent.
It's time to recognize that we've come to a turning point. We're threatened with an economic calamity of tremendous proportions, and the old business-as-usual treatment can't save us. Together, we must chart a different course. We must increase productivity. That means making it possible for industry to modernize and make use of the technology which we ourselves invented. That means putting Americans back to work, and that means, above all, bringing government spending back within government revenues, which is the only way, together with increased productivity, that we can reduce and, yes, eliminate inflation.
The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. The only force strong enough to save our country is us. The only people brave enough to vote out this corrupt establishment is you, the American people. I'm doing this for the people and for the movement, and we will take back this country for you, and we will make America great again.
Hello and welcome. I'm Mark Lucas. The intent of this documentary is to share with you the site of the IRS and the income tax that millions of people have learned about in the recent years. Business owners all over the country are plagued with the fear that they may have to go through an expensive and time-consuming audit, or that a mistake may show up and they could lose thousands of dollars or even be put out of business. The information disclosed on this tape shall provide documentation and means to dispel the myths that planted that fear in the minds of business owners and the working people in general. Most businesses rely on CPAs, tax attorneys, and other tax professionals to handle their payroll and do the day-to-day accounting. That was certainly what I did when I had my own business. However, one day, I had the privilege of hearing a very qualified public accountant speak on the subject of withholding, and what I heard him and others say, and the evidence that I witnessed, changed my life. I closed my business, and for 11 months, I worked at putting that information together into this documentary so you can hear and see for yourselves.
I trained as an accountant. I trained as a CPA back in the 60s. I had a thriving tax practice after the CPA field. I processed thousands, if not millions, of paychecks for people, dutifully deducting taxes from them. Had a good time destroying other people's lives, I found out. The words of the Secretary of the Treasury, published as required, everything that applies to us. And in that words, it says that if, in effect, and I'm paraphrasing now, if you are an American citizen and you work for an American company and you live in the United States, your remuneration is not taxable.
I was very impressed with Mr. Bossett's accounting knowledge, and he was also the owner of a large firm. And this conference was held at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. I thought if anyone should know about taxation, he should.
I'm not revealing anything new. There's people in this room who studied this and discovered it 10 to 15 years ago. I mean, I haven't went back through everybody that has been involved in it, but I'm not talking about anything new. I discovered it on the net. I was reading an article that talked about how an employee could do this, how the employee could refute the employer. And I sat upright in bed one night, my gosh, if the employee can refute the employer, why can't the employer simply do it right in the first place?
The next guest speaker at the conference was a prominent business owner, and what he had to say floored me as he put something in front of me I never before thought possible.
I was struggling with these concepts. Gross income, source of income, items of income, and so on. I've talked to several CPAs, attorneys. I did research on the internet. I read law books. I've made copies of the laws from the law books. The research off the internet, I made copies of that, provided it for the employees. I put this information in the break room. And for 3 months, they were indoctrinated with the law. So on January 4th, I believe, which was the first work day of the year, we did stop withholding from 45 employees.
Many other wonderful guests spoke at the conference, but although Mr. Bob Schultz, the organizer of the event, had invited speakers from the IRS, Congress, and even the White House, nobody had the courage to show up and face the public and the media with some kind of explanation. Furthermore, I thought that media would have special breaking news stories about how Americans can keep their income tax money, and all those wonderful news would make front page in every newspaper in the country. When that did not happen, the first big question mark was planted in my mind. Then, on Fox TV, Channel 4 News, I saw an interview with an IRS spokesman, and when he said the words code and taxpayer,
there's no provision in the code that allows people not to pay or withhold income tax, and taxpayer has never won on that case.
When he said code and taxpayer, I knew I had my second and third question to start an investigation. Question 1, why didn't media and the press break the news about the income tax non-liability to the American people? Surely, keeping that third of the money they've been handing over every month would mean substantially more than the generous $600 per head that Congress took months to approve. And media did cover that very thoroughly, mind you. Question 2, can the IRS code allow or not allow people to do anything? And if it does have that power, since I'm supposed to know the law, can I be held accountable for not understanding the 7,000-page IRS publication? And question 3, does taxpayer mean any American? After being ridiculed by a couple of accountants and almost kicked out of an attorney's office, I decided to interview some people that had experience with court cases on issues of taxation. And here's what they had to say.
When you look at the amount of money that you're contributing to the system, doesn't it make sense that you go back and look at the book? The term taxable income means gross income minus the deductions allowed by this chapter other than the standard deduction. So, to have taxable income, we have to have gross income. And then we go to the term gross income, and it defines items of gross income that may be taxable. But it never says, throughout the entire subtitle, who's actually liable for this tax. It says this tax is imposed on the taxable income. It doesn't say it's imposed on the individual. It doesn't say it's imposed on the married individual. It doesn't say it's imposed on the American citizen. It says it's imposed on the taxable income. So who's liable to pay this tax? Well, when all is said and done, you find that subtitle A just goes in this circular loop, this incestuous loop, if you will, of definitions, cross definitions, and never really defines who is liable until you get to liability to withhold.
The only liability is in Section 1461. 1461 refers to the withholding agent, which is in 26 U.S.C. 7701A16, which defines the withholding agents under 1441, 1442, and 1443. 1441 is the withholding agent for withholding tax on non-resident aliens. 1442 is withholding tax on foreign corporations, and 1443 is foreign tax exempt organizations. So what that means is the majority of, in fact almost all employers really are not withholding agents as are defined in the Internal Revenue Code.
If you talk to anybody in the IRS, they can't make the distinction between Subtitle A and Subtitle C. In fact, one of the things I recommend if you ever get called in to an audit, or if you demand an administrative hearing, an appeals hearing, one of the things you should get on the record is you should ask the IRS representative there what tax it is they're trying to assess or levy. And of course they'll say, well, the income tax. And they say, well, yes, but the income tax is the entirety of Title 26, or are you talking about Subtitle A? Within that, there are specific taxes. You should ask them, is this an estate tax under Subtitle B? Is this an employment tax under Subtitle C? Or is this an income tax under Subtitle A? And chances are they won't even know what you're talking about, but at least you're kind of breaking down the code for them, because most agents don't even realize that these are different subtitles. They'll take a section from Subtitle A and apply it to a section in Subtitle F and add a section from Subtitle E and throw in something from Subtitle B and say that you're liable for this stuff, and they're not even the same body of law. Obviously, estate and gift taxes is a completely different tax than employment taxes or income taxes and so forth. So that's a good way to get on the record that the IRS itself doesn't even know what they're talking about most of the time.
I must say I can't blame you if you find that hard to believe, but here's what an ex-IRS agent had to say.
That's not something it's clear in most people's minds, most agents' minds. There's so much presumption that you owe a tax. You are a taxpayer. There's a presumption that everybody's a taxpayer. If you had income, then you obviously owe tax. If you owe tax, you have to file and declare that tax so it can get assessed. And that's a huge presumption to make.
So how does one distinguish between presumption and law?
The way the federal government makes laws applicable to the citizens of the states is they have to publish it in the Federal Register. So when you want to see a definition, the first place you need to go to is the Federal Register. From there, they'll take it from the Federal Register and they'll put it in, for example, 26 CFR, which is the Code of Federal Register, the Code of Federal regulations applicable to income taxes.
I have to cut in here for just a second because the 60 Minutes show featured a Georgetown University law professor, supposedly expert on taxation, denying adamantly the specific use of the word includes when used in conjunction with the word employee for the purpose of tax laws. For those of you who watch that show, this should come as a nice little treat. Well, my dear professor, to use your expression, hogwash this.
Let's go to the Federal Register, September the 7th, 1943, and this comes from section 404-104, page 12267, employee. And I'm giving you an exact quote here. The term employee specifically includes officers and employees, whether elected or appointed, of the United States, a state, a territory, or a political subdivision thereof, or of the District of Columbia, or of any agency or instrumentality of any one or more of the foregoing. Is that you? No, it's not me. And it's applicable to the Congress, it's applicable to the Senate, it's applicable to... We're talking about what? It specifically includes elected and appointed officials of the government. Now the government can't come back with his bogus arguments of, well, includes is expansive. When include is expansive, it can only be expanded to other meanings within the term defined. For example, if the government says, we are going to impose a tax on liquor, including rum, whiskey, and gin. Can they include Coca-Cola in there? It's like one of the IQ tests that we used to take in school where they'd give us a series of words and we'd have to say, well, which word doesn't fit in there? Well, Coca-Cola doesn't fit in there. It is not within the meaning of the term defined. So even though it could be expansive and include another type of vodka, you could include vodka in there. That's within the meaning of the term defined. But you can't include Coca-Cola.
If you go through the code and look at the use of the word includes, you'll find that Congress, through the excellent work of the Congressional Research Service, has done a beautiful job of being absolutely consistent in the use of this word. So, what does this mean to the employer as far as withholding from his employees' wages? Well, what it essentially means is that you're not required to withhold unless your employee is an officer of some public entity or an officer of a corporation. Most people who are employers will withhold from their employees' wages a Social Security tax, which we all know is 7 3/4, almost 8% now, and that Social Security tax is a tax on the employer measured by wages. Now, the wages of the employee are not really taxable unless the employee gives you permission. This is done through what's commonly referred to as the W-4 form, and if you look at the W-4 form, it says on its face, withholding allowance certificate. This is where the employee allows the employer to withhold and is certifying that allowance by signing his signature to that document. It's important to note that the Social Security tax levied on the employer, measured by the employee's wages, which we commonly refer to as the employer's contribution to the Social Security, that tax has been held by the Supreme Court in the case of U.S. versus Silk, which I believe is a 46 case, to be a legitimate excise. And while that may be arguable and we may want to change the law there, I would not recommend to any employer that they forego paying that tax unless they are operating without a tax ID number, unless they have not executed a SS4 form wherein they essentially state that they are a withholding agent, because even if the tax is properly levied, there is no requirement at law that the employer become an agent of the federal government and a tax collector. The federal government, the proper way to avoid that would be to let the Treasury know that they're perfectly willing to post one of their officers at your place of business and collect this tax if they like. Or in the alternative, you can make a determination as to what the cost is to your business to collect this tax for them and ask them how they want to pay you for that. Chances are they will ignore your request, in which case there's no obligation at law for you to become an agent of the federal government. You are not a tax collector. And unless they're willing to pay you for it, they can't take your property without just compensation. This is also part of the Bill of Rights. There's lots of other deficiencies in the way the tax code is enforced that when all taken together, there's just it makes it untenable that we have the situation we have today. But in any case, what happens normally is then the employee executes the W-4. If the employee doesn't execute a W-4, most employers will contact the IRS, and the IRS will say, well, then you have to withhold at the rate of one exemption. And this simply is not the case. There is no authority to withhold.
How does one find out about the authority of an agency like the IRS or even the federal government? Here's what a 30-year veteran attorney that majored in government had to say.
The way that you find that is by, of course, going to the Constitution and examining the power of Congress to make laws with respect to income. You're not going to find any power over private income. The Congress has no power to impose an income tax, say, on a dentist in Grand Rapids. Even a dentist who employs a receptionist and a dental hygienist and a janitor, because there's just no federal connection. There's no authority there.
If I look to see where does it say that the revenue officer position exists and where's my authority for doing the things that I did, it's not there.
Well then, if there's no authority, how does the IRS do it?
If Americans knew on a large scale that if they don't file a 1040 and that the IRS does it for them and then tries to collect the tax, if they knew that IRS can't lawfully do that, there'd be a lot of outraged citizens. What happens is that the IRS procedures call for them to be able to do an audit. They have to have a tax return to examine, to audit.
So what happens if somebody does not file a return?
When IRS recognizes that a person hasn't filed the Form 1040, they, in order to follow their procedures correctly, they make this thing called a substitute for return, a dummy return. It has no income or tax information, tax liability information on it. It has entity information only, your name, your social security, your address. The agent also has, separately from the tax return, a folder, a file, some working papers, and he gathers in that other information that does have indications of money that you've earned by virtue of paper trail items, W-2s, 1099s, bank interest forms, different things that he has to have an awareness that you made some money. And so they make the presumption that therefore you have a tax liability.
They're not dealing with you as a private citizen. You are an individual with respect to the national government. You've done something. And that is, you've gone to work using a social security number. Somebody asked you for your social security number. You gave it. They have a federal identification number. They think they're a federal employer. They report your income as gross income. Gross income is what they tax. You are now a taxpayer.
And taxpayer has never won on that case.
If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, and if it's got feathers and all that stuff, then it's a taxpayer.
I had been doing the job for 10 years. Basically was minding my own business, relatively happy doing the job. And an acquaintance approached me and was making some claims. A lot of claims. Basically the claims were that people didn't have to file their 1040 tax returns. People didn't have to pay the income tax. Claims that the Federal Reserve was behind the collection agency, IRS. And I disputed those claims. We had kind of an interesting conversation. At one point in time, he just looked at me and said, look, you have access to the law, don't you? He said, have you ever looked at the law closely and examined these things for your own self? And I said, well, no, I haven't. The IRS trains revenue officers to know procedures in how to go about their job. So he said, do me a favor. He said, how about if you go research these things and tell me whether or not I'm wrong? And I thought about that. I thought that was an unusual request, but I decided, okay, I can do that because I know I'm right and I know he's wrong, and I'll take some time and go find the laws and the things that will show that that I'm right. And lo and behold, several weeks into it, I started having some difficulties. More of the information that I was coming across from studying the Internal Revenue Code, the regulations, case law, the Constitution, talking to other people in the movement who had, the tax movement, who had spent many years in some cases gathering information, and so there it was in front of me in the form of books and other information that would save me time as I was learning. I began to find out that the people that were saying that there is no law that compels most people to file an income tax return was true. I found at some point in time there that I was wrong, that I didn't have the authority that I needed as a revenue officer to go out and summons people's records from the bank, levy their wages at their employer, that I didn't have the authority to seize their property by virtue of the fact of just giving them a notice of seizure. I was really disturbed about it, because here I was doing that job and thinking that I was part of the solution, not part of the problem, thinking that I was doing something good. Somebody has to collect the taxes, why not me? So I finally just put in a resignation with IRS and left because it was a matter of conscience at that point.
One day I heard the media talking about this concept of Tax Freedom Day, and that got me wondering, well, if there's freedom, then there must also be some form of slavery before Tax Freedom Day. They were saying the Tax Freedom Day during that given year was 4.5 months into the year. So I started looking into the tax laws as a way to understand what that meant. To me, I've always thought that we lived in a free country and that income taxes were un-American because they deprived people of property. And of course, the most important kind of property a person has is their own labor and the wages that result from that labor. And that's something we're born with. It's not something the government gives us. It's not a privilege. It's a right. It's something we have. So I looked into some Supreme Court cases to find out what freedom really meant in terms of property rights and slavery. And I found a case of Yickwo versus Hopkins back in 1885, where the Supreme Court ruled for the very idea that one man may be compelled to hold his life or the means of living or any material right essential to the enjoyment of life at the mere will of another seems to be intolerable in any country where freedom prevails, as being the essence of slavery itself. And so that got me thinking, gosh, well, maybe I need to look into this a little bit more. And I was so amazed and upset about what I found out that I decided to write a book so that I could share what I knew and learned with everyone. The more research I did, the more corruption and scandal I found. I found that the income tax subject is a bottomless pit of scandal and corruption, and there is no end of material.
I'm here with an independent businessman named Nick Jessen, who thinks that the IRS is doing something illegal, especially when it comes to sending out a notice of levy. Nick, explain your point to me. What do you think the IRS is doing that's wrong?
Well, they've sent out a notice of levy on one of my employees last year, and I called them up and asked them if I had to comply. And of course they said I did have to comply, but when I mentioned to them there was a paragraph A missing, they hung up on me. And at that time I threw the notice of levy in the trash and I've not heard a word from them.
Now, that paragraph that's missing was on this letter. It started with paragraph B instead of A, right?
That's correct.
And then you started to investigate.
Yes.
And when you found out what paragraph A said, what did you learn?
Well, I was surprised at first, but paragraph A indicated the only person that could levy anyone was the Secretary of Treasury. The only person that could be levied is a government employee.
IRS on occasion has answered that question, and they've said that they removed it because it was confusing to taxpayers. Well, it's obvious why it would be seen as confusing, because the paragraph A is in the Internal Revenue Code under 6331. It says clearly who the notice of levy may be served on. And it's referring there, for the most part, to government employees, government officials. So, yes, if you're a private employer and you look at the notice of levy that's come to you from the IRS on one of your employees, and you turn over and look at the code sections that are there to tell you ostensibly what is their authority for doing this, and you don't see paragraph A, well, as an employer, you don't think about it. But if you were to go look at the code and see what paragraph A says, of course the IRS wants that confusion taken away, because it tells them that the government employee...
Hello, my name's Rich Merritt. You've been watching Understanding the Truth Behind the IRS. This is part 2 of a series. Last week we watched America, Freedom to Fascism by Aaron Russo. The reason we're putting these films out, by the way, is that you don't have to pay a tax on your time and your labor, your wages and your compensation in America. Most people, as they said, elected and appointed officials do. So if you're one of the people working 2 or 3 or 4 jobs and you want to quit 1 or 2 of them and save your money, watch these videos. Educate yourself. It's worth it. Thank you for watching, and please share it.